Okay, good morning, councillors. I forgot where the microphone was over the Christmas vacation. I'm going to call to order before we get past the deadline, or our past budget chief will come up and take the chair. I just want to welcome our former councillor and former budget chief, Gary Crawford. He's here to check my work. No, we're very happy to have him considering his current role. Thank you so much for coming, Gary. So good morning for those online. My name is Councillor Shelley Carroll, and I'm the chair of the Budget Committee. We do have quorum, so I call meeting number 7 of the Budget Committee in this term to order. Welcome everyone, and Happy New Year, if I haven't already wished you one. Today's meeting is being held in person at City Hall in Committee Room 1. This meeting is also being live streamed online at YouTube/Toronto City Council Live. And I'll just begin by making our land acknowledgement. Although we may be meeting in different locations today, the infrastructure and environment, I've got Works' script. The Budget Committee, would like to acknowledge that the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I also want to make our African ancestral acknowledgement. Though I'm not a person of African descent, I am committed to continually acting in support of and in solidarity with Black communities that are seeking freedom and reparative justice in light of the history and ongoing legacy of slavery and of the continued impact on Black communities in Canada. As part of this commitment, I'd also like to acknowledge that not all people came to these lands as migrants or settlers. Specifically, I want to acknowledge those who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. In support of the City of Toronto's ongoing efforts to confront anti-Black racism, I pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent. So we can get underway. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest to do with the budget? Seeing none, this is very much an info meeting. If you do have an interest, you'll let us know in advance as we start our way through the budget process. Can I have a motion to confirm the minutes from the 2024 Budget Committee of January 10th, January 16th, 17th, and 18th, which was our councillor review, 2022 and 23 and in 24, which was the deputations last year, and lastly, January 24th, 2024, which was our wrap-up meeting. Mr. Vice Chair, do you want to approve the minutes? All in favor? Opposed? Seeing none, that is carried. So let me just remind folks that the purpose of today's meeting is really to hear the presentation, to hear that overview presentation from the city manager, from the chief financial officer and treasurer on the 2025 operating and capital budgets. Before we start the presentation, I'm going to give a brief overview of how the process is going to unfold. And this is going up on the website even as we speak, but if there are any pieces here that aren't already there. We're responsible for hearing public presentations and providing advice to the mayor on the operating and capital budgets. So the Budget Committee will be making our final recommendations to the mayor in our meeting on Friday, January 24th. That's our wrap-up meeting. The detailed 2025 budget agenda, which includes all of the budget analyst notes, the briefing notes, and the supporting information from city divisions and agencies, will be published later today after this meeting has been completed. That's so that it hits the airwaves the same time that members of the media will be headed for a technical briefing. So folks will maybe have to wait till lunchtime, but is it looking good?
They're in.
Okay. Hopefully all goes smoothly. The budget agenda will be published on the clerk's website at toronto.ca council with more information to be found there at toronto.ca/budget as to our next 3 days of review, which divisions are when. I think most people will find that helpful. Budget Committee will meet later this week on the 15th, 16th, and 17th to review the 2025 budget in more detail when you can ask questions of city divisions and agencies. Members, if you need additional information from staff beyond what the analyst notes have provided, that budget, or it's not covered in a presentation, the detailed budget notes, and you want to request a briefing note from them, you can do so by motion when we meet later this week. Between the 15th and the 17th, we hope that you'll keep track of briefing notes that you want and flag it for us then, having finished asking your questions. Please send in any motions for briefing notes as soon as possible. It really helps us to make sure if there are duplicates that we're combining and getting a briefing note that makes the information as concise as possible. And I ask that you give permission to the clerk to share those motions with financial planning staff and chair so that they can coordinate and make sure that you get the information you need. Given the very short timeline between our budget review this week and our final wrap-up on the 24th, financial planning staff will be under a lot of pressure to complete all briefing notes requested by the committee in time. So please give consideration to that narrow timeline when making a motion to collect briefing notes. Some things, as we know, if there's a lot of history in it, it's going to take a little longer than they would have. We are scheduled to hear public speakers next week on Tuesday, January 21st and Wednesday, January 22nd. This year, there are meeting sessions timed for 9:30 a.m., 1:30 p.m., and 6 p.m. at all of the Civic Center locations. Members of the public who wish to speak to the Budget Committee about the 2025 budget can register with the clerk at buc@toronto.ca and choosing a meeting time on either of the 21st or the 22nd within those time slots. The presentation that we're about to hear is available on the clerk's website at toronto.ca/council. Remember, we're changing years, so it's time to, when you want to know all things budget, it's City Budget 2025. Don't do a typo and hit 24. But that page is already up. So following the presentation from our CFO and City Manager, I'm going to open the floor and create a list of members' names for questions of staff. And I hope that people will remember that it is about the overview presentation, the detail you'll have 3 days to do going forward. I'd like to thank city staff before we get started because they have worked very hard. As usual, we spoiled your holidays. So I really want to thank them for all the work they've done and the public service who've worked with the financial units to achieve this budget. I want to also thank the mayor who was upstairs for part of the presentation. You should know that she had a whole year to work on this presentation. So you're looking at a budget that she's already very, very familiar with. So I think that will make this a little bit more concise process. And now I'm going to turn it over to the city manager and the CFO to give the presentation. You guys want to? Oh, yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Budget Chief Carroll. I just wanted to know if all of the budget notes and briefing notes are also being released today, because that would help us to inform any further requests for briefing notes.
Yes, you'll have them later this afternoon, hopefully around lunchtime.
Okay.
As the media go into technical briefings, they should all be getting uploaded there. Yeah.
And then the ones that we can submit for briefing note requests, will we have the opportunity to move those on Wednesday and Thursday afternoons as well, so that you're not just waiting until Friday and give staff more time?
Yeah. If you know, if that division is currently presenting and you need that more information, flagging it right then and there means that we can, then as people who may not be attending may ask the same question, and we can say, well, there's already a request. So in that regard, budget committee members are most helpful, because some people will decide they need something at the very last minute, and you've already dedicated so much of your time that you've already noted that information needs to be added.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm going to turn off my microphone. As my father used to say, shoot, Luke, the air is full of pigeons. Mr. City Manager.
Well, Chair, thank you, and that's quite an introduction to our presentation. Thank you for that as well. It's our pleasure to be here this morning to present an overview of the 2025 budget. I want to first start by thanking this committee for its ongoing work with our budget process. And as we get into the presentation, I want to thank our Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer, Steve Conforti, and his team for all the work that they have put into it. I'll provide a brief overview in the first few slides and then turn it over to our CFO for his longer context in both the operating and capital budgets. So let's jump right in. The 2025 budget highlights are that we have, as we're required to do and as we do each year, and we're presenting today a balanced budget. On the operating side, it's a budget of $18.8 billion, which is an increase from last year. And on the capital side, nearly $60 billion, also an increase from 2024. We'll go into why those increases are there and what's happening with those. But I do want to thank all of the folks across the city who have contributed to building this year's budget. The operating budget is supported by a recommended 5.4% residential property tax increase. The capital budget, of course, as was Council's decision, is continuing to be supported by a 1.5% increase to the city building fund. That combined puts the property tax increase for 2025 at 6.9%. There are a number of investments that match with what we've been hearing through the budget consultations, what we've been hearing through the citywide survey that was conducted in August and September around priorities here in the city. And it does align with the multi-year approach we're taking towards our budgeting, as well as the work that we're doing with other orders of government, in particular with our provincial partners that I'll talk about in just a few minutes, to help make sure that we move towards a sustainable future. In all, our goal is to continue to advance a more resilient and sustainable financial future. We mentioned last year that this was going to take us a few years to do, and we are on track to make that happen. If we move to the next slide, I do want to present to you today that the approach that we outlined for you last year is working, and we can see a future forward that puts the City of Toronto on a much stronger financial footing. We will go into detail around the continuing partnerships that we need in order to achieve that success, but I can tell you that the plan today is working. In 2024, you'll recall, we opened with a budget pressure of $1.8 billion, the largest that anyone can remember, and certainly one that we could not close without the support of other orders of government helping us. And as you know, that came through. I'm pleased to note that in 2025, although still a large opening pressure at $1.2 billion, you can see the decline. And this slide indicates that our projections for 2026 and 2027 have this opening pressure continuing to decline based on the work that we're doing that's outlined in the bullet points across 2024, this past year, 2025, our current year, and into 2026 and beyond. Our long-term financial plan clearly laid out that this was going to take a few years to happen if we wanted to ensure there were not dramatic changes to service levels across the City of Toronto. And I can state to you today that the service levels and our services that we provide to the people who live, work, play, and learn in the City of Toronto continue to be at a level that people have seen in the past, and in targeted areas, we've seen continued new investments. So this multi-year approach will require us to continue to work on our financial strategies, both on an operating and capital side, but we do see a time as early as 2027 where our opening pressure is much more in line with what we've seen in the past. One of the things you will note in our budget is a rather large increase in the gross expenditures from an operating perspective, from $17 billion to $18.8 billion. And if you simply do the math on that increase, it's 10.5%. I want to be very clear, and why we've included this slide is to be very clear that that is a gross change in our budget which is very much impacted by some flow-throughs that we have from other orders of government. It is not a reflection on the increased city expenditures, which you can see from this slide, are more in line with about a 3.8% increase. So let's talk about why that gross number is so large. There are a number of initiatives that we receive funding from, really as a flow-through from other orders of government. One of the largest, and it's a good news story, is about $570 million in new funding under the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Program. This provides for a more affordable childcare in this city, as is happening across communities across this country. So at $570 million, that has no impact on the property taxpayers of the City of Toronto. That is a good news story of our work with other orders of government. Other impacts in this area are really a sign of the times. The reality is our caseloads for Ontario Works and are up, and as a result, the 100% contribution from the province of Ontario to the social assistance payments that are received by individuals in our community are again put into the city's budget. Because of the times that we're living in, those expenditures are up. Our caseloads are up. So while not a great news story, the fact that more money is flowing into the city, again, does not impact the property taxpayer. There are also internal transfers that happen that make up some of this $18.8 billion. One of the examples that you see now in a consolidated budget for the first time in 2025 is our work on the FIFA event in 2026. There is one budget that shows you how those expenses are rolling out from a year-to-year process matched against the $380 million budget. But of course, the work happens across many divisions and agencies, boards, and corporations. And so that work then has to be transferred and those resources transferred to those budgets so the work can actually happen. Another example is the increased rates that we're collecting for Toronto Water. Some of those are being transferred to the capital program. And again, those internal transfers make up in total about $336 million of that gross change. So I do want to focus on what is around increased city expenditures, about $650 million. And as I say, if you looked at it from a year-over-year increase perspective, about 3.8%. About 90% of those increased costs are across some very few areas, but very important areas for the City of Toronto. Our transit services, our emergency services, our the largest social housing provider in the country in Toronto Community Housing. And of course, in 2025, we are in a collective agreement year, and we are settling with many of our unions. We've done some of those settlements, and some of them are ongoing. So when you look at those increased costs, those are the areas that account for most of it. And the reality is that is what we need in order to keep our city moving forward. So again, I know the story will be, look at the huge increase in expenditures by the City of Toronto. We've provided this slide so that we can all communicate clearly that much of that is a flow through of other orders of government, some of which is very good news for this community, and that when it comes to increased city expenditures, there's a strong rationale for why we're investing in the areas that we are, that make up 90% of that increase, and overall, a decent level of increase matched to the amount of service that we need to provide. So I did want to spend just a few minutes on that, Chair. As we move forward, there are some fundamentals in our budget that remain unchanged. And on this next slide, you can see the impact of our work and our investments in this community on the provincial and national scale. The reality is that as Toronto is stronger, so is Ontario, and so is our country. We account for 1 in every 5 jobs in Ontario. We account, as you heard last year, and continue to account for about 20% of the GDP of this country and over 50% of the GDP in this province. We welcome more than 26 million visitors annually. We have a massive capital program that provides jobs and investments in key sectors from an economic perspective. And those that do business in this city generate billions annually in income, corporate, and sales taxes to other orders of government. We always put the chart on the right side of this slide in just to remind folks that from a tax perspective and a revenue perspective through taxes, municipalities, including Toronto, receive a tiny share of those revenues based on compared to other orders of government. So our impact provincially and federally, has not changed, and therefore, the fact that we need to work together has not changed as well. If you remember when the long-term financial plan came forward in 2023 as we look forward to a 2024 budget, it was very clear that the City of Toronto has things that they needed to do, and the City of Toronto has responded. We have found ways in order to make sure that our budgets are as efficient and effective as possible, and that our investments and our use of the tools that we have to generate resources and revenues are used as wisely as possible. But we needed other orders of government to come to the table and help. Of course, we were all very pleased with the success of the New Deal, as they were called, conversations with the provincial government. And while there were also some federal contributions that came, I really want to focus in on what the work that happened between our mayor and the premier of this province, and the work that was flowed to us to complete as civil servants to create the New Deal that was signed off in late 2023 and helped us in our 2024 budget. This slide gives you a sense of some of those investments that were there and what they needed to do to help us address. In 2024, that operating pressure simply would not have been closed had we not had a significant contribution from the provincial government. And we can't thank them enough for investing in those areas that we clearly articulated through our long-term financial plan had a uniqueness in Toronto that simply did not exist in other municipalities across this province. Those areas included transit. Those areas included housing and homelessness. And those areas included our massive issues around capital work. So we do have operating funding guaranteed over a 3-year period in those areas. Operating dollars for transit, operating dollars for our shelter system. And in addition to that, we've also been able to achieve funding through funds that have been set up for all municipalities, such as the Building Faster Fund, and that is a result of us meeting and exceeding, in some cases, our housing targets. And I'm pleased to say in 2024, it appears that we will once again be strong in terms of matching against our housing target, but we know that tougher times are ahead in 2025 as we try to continue to build the housing that's required for this community. It also goes without saying that the fact the province is uploading to their oversight the Gardiner Expressway and Don Valley Parkway provided an immediate relief in 2 ways to the City of Toronto. First of all, it will eliminate the single largest state of good repair impact on our budget that we had. That stretch of road is the single largest capital project in terms of its impact on state of good repair. So secondly, we were able over the 10-year period to invest those resources in other categories of capital spending that also have pressures on state of good repair. And the good work of council to recognize those areas means that we are underway in allowing parts of our organization to have increased resources to address state of good repair. Again, that partnership with the provincial government has allowed us to make a $1.9 billion investment in state of good repair over the next 10 years that we simply would not have been able to make without that partnership. And I know that you mentioned, Chair, at the beginning of the meeting that Gary Crawford is here with us. And as you know, we are committed to continuing our work with the New Deal. The province has committed in 2025 to begin the discussions around what the future New Deal will look like. And we'll continue to work with our provincial counterparts, including Mr. Crawford in his new role with the provincial government as he acts as an advisor to government around this New Deal. So that's the good news around the New Deal that came forward. And I do want to acknowledge, of course, the federal government coming forward and helping us, particularly with funding for refugee and asylum seekers who are accessing our shelter system. And at the very tail end of 2024, the announcement that we have now completed the 3-way investment strategy to ensure the acquisition of 55 new subway cars for Line 2 of the TTC. So that's the good news, but our challenges remain. And this slide shows just some of those challenges that remain for the City of Toronto. Quite rightly, people have pointed out that even with the success of the New Deal in 2023, heading into our 2024 budget, it did not change some of these systemic challenges in the long term. That is what we will be continuing to discuss with other orders of government. We, in some cases, operate the largest systems in the country and some of the largest in North America from a service perspective. We continue to have pressures on our city that simply don't exist in other places in Ontario or across this country. And like all municipalities, Toronto has limited revenue tools, and they are largely disconnected from economic growth, as we would say, without access to taxes that grow in terms of income taxes or in terms of sales taxes. We have a heavy reliance on property taxes. And that is simply not sustainable. We understand that. We've articulated it for years. Long before I joined the City of Toronto, this has been clearly articulated, and it once again was articulated in 2023 in our long-term financial plan. The other piece that we know in terms of both budget and programming is that we continue to rise to the challenge time after time in the City of Toronto. We continue to operate these programs that are the largest in the country, that have some of the most complex issues that they respond to in the country. And we continue to do that with the investment of Torontonians in many, many different ways. We continue to invest in our capital program, and you'll see this year again, continue to raise that investment as we continue to maintain critical infrastructure and address our state of good repair. But the reality is that as things confront this community, we will need those continued partnerships if we are to continue to deliver the services Torontonians expect. That is why we continue to say and point back to our long-term financial plan. Toronto has work that it needs to do and will continue to do. You have been very clear with what you want us to try and achieve in terms of financial sustainability and service level delivery. But the reality is, if we are to be fully sustainable from a financial perspective, we will need the support of other orders of government. I want to conclude with looking at the results that were delivered and a snapshot of some of the results that were delivered from the 2024 investment achieved through the budget and achieved by our city. This slide highlights some key areas. These are key areas that continue to come forward from our consultation and survey work of where those that live, work, and do business in the city want us to make investments. It's also clear from a council perspective where your priorities are, and they match with the strategic priorities that you have set for us as our governing body. We do invest in public safety across our emergency services, and it is seeing results. A 5.7-minute reduction in police response time is something that is very pleasing for all of us to see. The fact now that residents everywhere in the City of Toronto have access to the Toronto Community Crisis Service means there is a non-police alternative for those experiencing issues of mental health. From a roads perspective, we know that we need to keep our roads infrastructure working, and we're doing that by filling more potholes, by ensuring that we do everything in our power to deal with congestion management as we also make unprecedented capital investments across our city. From a transit perspective, more hours of service are available and transit fares are frozen, part of a response to the affordability challenges that Torontonians speak of each and every day. Our affordable housing program has been invested in 2024 in ways that are both consistent with our overall approaches on our 10-year housing plan, but also in new ways as we're confronted with new realities and new challenges to building housing in this community. Most recently, in the fall of 2024, reports that provided incentives to develop more than 12,000 new rental homes. And across our community, Torontonians are able to access more services that make sense, sometimes to our most vulnerable and sometimes to all of those who enjoy this great city. It can be increased nutrition through school food programs. It is the fact that many more of our libraries are open 7 days a week. An increase of Sunday service is something that has been talked about for a while, and we are now seeing it happen within our library system. We have more bookings available in our recreation centers, including more spaces for people in those traditional programs that people clamor for each and every year, and more drop-in hours for those that wish to simply come and enjoy our fantastic recreational facilities. And for our young people, which will be a theme again in 2025's budget, we now have more youth hubs up and running as places for young people to invest in. So I conclude by saying that we are on a pathway where we can see the march towards sustainability. As we develop each year's budgets, we are very clear to try and find ways that we can suggest how we match our priorities from a community perspective and from a council perspective in terms of the budget that we produce. But I need to make it very clear as I turn things over to our Chief Financial Officer, this pathway to success will only be possible if we have those continued partnerships, not only with the taxpayers of the City of Toronto, but also with other orders of government who will be critical to our success in the long term. Thanks, and over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Paul. And before I start, I'd like to extend my thanks to our Budget Chair, Councillor Carroll, and Budget Committee members for all your support in this year's process. I'd also like to take a moment to extend my thanks to staff across the organization that have supported the budget development and helped us get to this point today. That has to start with our Executive Director of Financial Planning, Althea Hutchinson, who has been a valued partner to me and the architect behind this year's budget. And of course, I need to extend that thanks to our entire team in Financial Planning Division. I'd also like to thank Cindy Williamson, just to my left, and all my supports in the Office of the CFO, and all of the finance leads across our organization, where we worked closely with Annalisa Mignardi, Marco Cuoco, Alan Cohen, and Vivian Ching, and their respective teams to prepare the 2025 budget. Collectively, we are now ready to launch a balanced budget for 2025. This year's budget continues to address our financial challenges through a multi-year approach that began last year and is already demonstrating positive progress. We began the process with a $1.2 billion opening pressure that has been addressed through continued actions from our long-term financial plan, planned bridging strategies consistent with our multi-year approach, $680 million in reductions in offsets identified through our review process. And ultimately, it's supported by a 5.4% residential property tax increase specific to the operating budget. While developing this year's budget, we were committed to maintaining critical services and service levels and continuing to apply the benefits achieved through our various partnerships with the federal and provincial governments. We again had an opportunity to hear from the public prior to our budget launch today. We heard from 763 residents as part of budget consultation sessions and garnered over 12,000 responses to our online budget survey. Through these consultations, we heard what was most important to our residents were investments in making life affordable, providing community service, getting Toronto moving, and keeping people safe. And while the budget primarily aims to maintain and preserve services and continue down a path towards enhanced fiscal sustainability, we have also made critical new investments totaling $94 million in these areas most valued by our residents. As we began work on the 2025 budget, we also had to consider with bringing forward a balanced budget, both those challenges that are unique to municipal budgeting or unique to the City of Toronto itself. Like other municipalities, we have limited revenue options with a heavy reliance on property tax revenue that, unlike sales tax or income tax, is relatively static outside of an annual rate change. While there is limited natural growth in our revenue base, we continue to experience both added costs to deliver municipal services, as well as growing demand for our services driven by population growth and an aging demographic. On top of that, Toronto has unique challenges above and beyond our peers, arising from operations of our transit system and increasing demand and complexities for our shelter and social services. That said, we are presenting a balanced budget, and I'll take you through the next few slides to highlight the actions that we've taken to make that happen. We are presenting an operating budget of $18.8 billion in gross expenditures. This includes $16.6 billion or 88% of the overall budget for our tax-supported programs, and $2.2 billion, or 12%, for our rate-supported programs, which include Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and the Parking Authority. Total expenditures of $18.8 billion in the 2025 combined tax and rate-supported operating budgets reflect a $1.8 billion increase from the 2024 budget. However, as Paul noted earlier, when adjusting for added flow-through funding from the federal and provincial governments like the Early Learning and Childcare Program, and adjusting for our own internal transfers, a more accurate reflection of increased operating expenditures from the city would be $654 million, or a 3.8% increase compared to last year. This slide shows the total gross and net budget for 2025 with the full length of the bar depicting the total spend for 2025 and the yellow bars representing the amount of property tax funding dedicated to delivering those services. As reflected in this table, we continue to spend a significant amount on the city's cost-shared social programs, with a total of $5.1 billion in 2025. This includes programs which receive contributions from other orders of government, such as Toronto Employment and Social Services, Children's Services, Shelter Support, Housing, Toronto Community Housing, and also includes long-term care homes and public health. I won't speak to all the categories, but I'll quickly note more than $2.8 billion in spending is for transit services, which is the next major spending category. Next are our rate programs, reflecting 12% of total investments, then the police budget with $1.4 billion in total spend. The $1.27 billion in capital financing support, with about $970 million in debt servicing costs and nearly $300 million in capital from current funding. I'll also point out corporate accounts with $1.25 billion includes expenses incurred on behalf of the entire organization, such as insurance and employee-related liabilities. This is also where we capture corporate revenue, such as dividends, land transfer tax, which is why the budget reflects an overall net revenue in the graphic. We've shown this slide over the last few years, and it captures the historical opening budget pressure the city has faced on an annual basis that's had to be addressed to ultimately present a balanced budget. Traditionally, the city would experience about a $600 million opening pressure. What is important about this slide is actually 2024, where the nearly $1.8 billion pressure wasn't as significant as the pressures that we faced during the pandemic, but the key difference was there was no longer any expected COVID support funding included in our budget, and all the remaining sustained pandemic impacts, coupled with significant growth and inflationary impacts, needed to be fully addressed by our property tax base and other available city revenues. Given the magnitude of that opening pressure and to avoid otherwise necessary reductions to critical city services, we introduced a multi-year strategy to successfully transition these pressures, including sustained COVID impacts, to be permanently funded within the city's budget in a way where we could, over time, get our annual opening budget pressure back in the range of $700 to $800 million. As you can see with the 2025 opening pressure of $1.2 billion, our strategy, coupled with provincial support from the New Deal, is working. In fact, the multi-year approach was specifically referenced as one of the reasons given by our credit rating agency when we received our first credit rating increase in decades last year. While we're on the right path, we were still faced with a $1.2 billion opening pressure in 2025, which is double our traditional experience of $600 million and needs to be offset to achieve a balanced budget. So this is an updated version of a slide that we've used in our budget consultation processes and aims to provide a visual representation of the budget challenges we face in 2025. The large red tower that you see on the left of the graphic represents to scale the 2025 opening budget pressure of $1.2 billion. That much smaller green box just to the right of it reflects $46.4 million in annual revenue that is generated from every 1% residential property tax increase. So, and only to provide perspective, to fully offset a $1.2 billion pressure through a property tax change alone, we would have required a 26% residential property tax increase. Now, the other towers you see provide a to-scale visual of the portion of property tax funding that supports municipal services we provide in Toronto. So alternatively, if we were to have approached the 2025 budget through program reductions alone, we would need to eliminate expenses equivalent to the full cost of our transit service in the city. That would include subways, streetcars, buses, and even Wheel-Trans service to bring forward a balanced budget. So obviously, we didn't take either of those actions, and I'll take you through the approach that we have taken to bring forward a balanced budget in 2025. Excuse me. We are presenting a balanced budget with the continued lens of a multi-year approach through 5 key balancing actions. First, as we always do as part of the annual budget process, staff review budget submissions and identify potential opportunities for offsets, efficiencies, and other revenue actions. This year, those actions totaled $680 million in offsets. which, when factoring both $152 million in opportunities identified as part of the budget submissions and a further $528 million in offsets identified post-submission during our internal review process. These actions include $93 million from line-by-line program reviews, where we look at each expenditure category and specific commitment items to ensure budgets reflect both prior year actual spending and our expectations in 2025. We also have $41 million in efficiencies. This includes great work by our staff in shelter and support services to drive savings from renegotiated hotel contracts, efforts from our teams in corporate services, where technology services either decommissioned or renegotiated pricing on system applications, and fleet services, who introduced a series of actions from retreading of tires to reassigning underutilized vehicles. Even our credit rating increase, achieved through our prudent fiscal management and the Ontario-Toronto New Deal, results in reductions in debt servicing costs. $294 million was also achieved through our program and agency reviews following budget submissions. Both our financial planning and program staff work collaboratively to validate all budget assumptions and estimates, providing essentially a challenge function. This includes prioritization of expenditures, considering affordability, and validating timing and cost assumptions. We also included $219 million in offsets through revenue adjustments, arising from a combination of inflation and volume changes to user fee revenue and expected increases within our corporate revenues, like investment income and our land transfer tax. Our second action includes $41 million from continued realization of additional offsets achieved from actions implemented as part of our long-term financial plan. This includes added revenue from the graduated municipal land transfer tax rates on high-value properties, and revenues expected from the newly implemented non-resident speculation tax. Third, our balancing actions factor $330 million in multi-year bridging strategies, which represent planned reserve draws that were designed to be temporary measures to strategically manage the pressure we face over the next few years. As these bridging strategies are reversed in 2026 and 2027, they'll be replaced through other planned actions that are expected to materialize over the next few years, predominantly those arising as part of the long-term financial plan. Fourth, the 2025 operating budget incorporates $250 million in additional revenue generated from a property tax rate increase of 5.4%. And lastly, consistent with our recent experience, we expect continued federal funding to offset added costs for refugee claimant response. This year's budget was heavily influenced by a series of public consultation sessions held this past fall. Initiated by the mayor and the budget chair, the city hosted a month-long engagement campaign, including the online survey and various consultation sessions for residents to participate in. In total, the city received over 12,000 responses to our online budget survey. We also got to meet with 763 participants at 6 different sessions, including in-person and virtual options across the city. An additional 313 participants joined in a local meeting hosted by community organizations within Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities. Major themes that were identified by the public that coincide with where we have made added investments include making life affordable, with a focus on affordable housing and for costs associated with transit, childcare, and food, getting Toronto moving, expanding and improving reliability and accessibility of the TTC and traffic infrastructure, providing community services, needs for enhanced programming at parks, libraries, and community centers, as well as climate action programs, and keeping people safe, prioritizing violence prevention and proactive measures, as well as increased funding for emergency services. The 2025 budget includes additional spending of $94 million in new and enhanced initiatives in areas consistent with what we heard during public consultations. For making life affordable, we're supporting over 8,000 students in school food programs. We're supporting over 31,000 youth in Camp TO food programs, and added 300 households that will be supported through the Rent Bank program. For Getting Toronto Moving, the TTC budget includes funding for about 500,000 additional hours of transit service. Funding is also included for pilot projects aimed to reduce bunching and gapping on key bus and streetcar routes. We're also continuing to add traffic agents. We will now have 100 agents, 4 times more than what we had at this time last year, which will continue to help improve travel times in key corridors. We're providing community services, expanding Sunday service hours that will now be available at over 70 libraries, investing in keeping our recreation facilities cleaner, which was a key feedback we heard from the public, and making outdoor pools available for an extra 2 hours daily. We're also keeping people safe, continuing to invest in emergency services with 276 added positions between fire, police, and paramedic services, while at the same time also investing in youth violence prevention programs. Advancing financial sustainability for the city while preserving critical city services requires us to continue to develop our budget through a multi-year approach. Our current estimated opening pressure for 2026 is approximately $1.07 billion. This includes the reversal of many of our bridging strategies, full-year costs for 2025 enhancements, and expected growth and inflationary pressures. We expect the city's opening pressure could be further reduced to as low as $734 million by 2027, which is far closer to our historical experience and sets the stage for enhanced financial sustainability within our operating budget. Absent any new or unforeseen pressures, this can be achieved by 2027 within our multi-year plan through the phased reversal of temporary budget bridging strategies, further implementation of remaining long-term financial plan actions, the continued identification of additional annual offsets and reductions like the $680 million identified this year, and consistent with our multi-year approach, we have assumed multi-year tax rate scenarios that do not reflect any approved plan but does support for modeling purposes. It is important to note that we will begin to see the reversal of the New Deal funding in 2027 when our current 3-year agreement comes to an end. That said, we continue to benefit from strong collaboration with our provincial partners, and initial actions have already begun and are underway to develop the New Deal 2.0 well in advance of the pressure noted in the outlook. As noted, the 2025 operating budget incorporates a residential property tax rate increase of 5.4%. This equates to an annual increase of $210 to the average home, which has an assessed value of about $692,000, or the equivalent of $17.50 monthly. And just for clarity, because I do get asked this quite often, the current assessed value for all residential properties in the city that is used for property tax purposes is accurate at $692,000. The reason why it differs from the average sale price of a home in Toronto is because the current assessed value is based on property valuations conducted in 2016, which is the most recent assessment by the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, or MPAC for short, for municipalities in Ontario. I'd also like to note that the city maintains property tax relief programs, including the tax increase deferral program and the tax increase cancellation programs. In 2024, these programs benefited over 10,000 households, and since 2015 has provided $44 million in tax relief. For multi-residential properties, the budget reflects an increase of 2.7%, which is half of the residential rate. This rate was considered with provincial rent guidelines in mind, ensuring it is below thresholds that would enable rent increases above provincial guidelines. We've also introduced a new multi-residential subclass that will be available to new multi-residential developments and provide a 15% reduction from the current residential rates. This slide highlights proposed property tax rate increases incorporated in the operating budget for business properties. The operating budget reflects an increase of 5.4% for industrial properties and 2.7% for commercial properties. The commercial rate increase is half our residential increase, consistent with provincial regulations related to tax ratio thresholds. Since 2022, the city has also maintained a small business property tax subclass, which provides a 15% rate reduction to eligible properties. This program, which was expanded last year, currently benefits over 28,000 small businesses. Back in December, City Council approved interim rate increases of 3.75% for both Toronto Water and Solid Waste Management Services, which include water and wastewater consumption rates and solid waste rates and fees. The prepared budget before you today confirms those rates with no change to the 3.75%. This will result in an average annual increase of $39 based on a 230 cubic meters of water consumed, and it will result in an average of $11 to $21 for single-family homes, depending on the size of their garbage bins. Okay, I'm now going to take us through the capital budget and plan. The 10-year capital budget totals nearly $60 billion, with $5.2 billion in spending in 2025 alone. This is the city's largest ever capital plan, and by a significant amount. The city's capital plan is increased by nearly $10 billion, or 20% compared to just last year's plan. The budget enables added, critical, and key investments in areas like transit and transportation infrastructure, aging city facilities that are critical to providing community services, and housing, flood protection, and net zero initiatives. Informed by our capital asset management plan and our capital prioritization framework, the 10-year capital plan not just prioritizes investments in critical state-of-good repair funding, but really moves the needle on addressing our SOGR backlog. 54% of planned spending, or $32.4 billion of the $60 billion capital plan, is dedicated to SOGR investments. This represents a 31% increase in SOGR funding over the last 2 years alone, and while the SOGR backlog is still expected to grow, we're now starting to see the flattening of that growth curve. This year's budget also continues to enhance our climate focus. Climate mitigation and adaptation actions aim to reduce over 160,000 tons of CO2 emissions, which is a 69% increase from the 2024 plan. And we continue to have great success with our sustainable debenture programs, with the issuance of both green bonds and social bonds to support finance capital infrastructure. The city is able to make significant increases in capital investments while maintaining a balanced plan and staying within our 15% debt service ratio. We've been able to do this through the incredible partnership secured with the province through the New Deal that has enabled the city to reallocate $1.9 billion in funding that was intended for the Gardiner Expressway to critical SOGR needs in the city, as well as provincial contributions towards new Line 2 subway cars that was unlocked thanks to the federal government and the Canada Public Transit Fund, with an expected $1.2 billion allocated to the City of Toronto. Furthermore, the budget continues to maximize the use of non-debt financing strategies wherever possible. And lastly, the capital budget continues to be supported by an added 1.5% levy increase for the City Building Fund, which is leveraged to support critical investments in transit and housing. Similar to the operating budget, we began on this year's capital program with consideration of challenges unique to our capital needs. On the demand side, we have to consider both the impact of our aging infrastructure on the cost and ability to maintain city services, as well as the need to make infrastructure investments that support a growing population and increased demand for city services. We also have to consider capacity. When I say that, I mean the capacity to deliver capital work, our financial capacity to support capital needs that extend beyond our sole financial reach, and how we prioritize capital work in the context of rising capital costs. I'll take you through the next few slides to highlight how we had to navigate these challenges while at the same time bringing forward the city's largest ever investment in capital infrastructure. Briefly, the 10-year gross capital plan is $59.6 billion. This includes $40.2 billion, or 67% for our tax-supported programs, and $19.4 billion, or 33% for our rate-supported programs of Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and the Parking Authority. The capital plan of nearly $60 billion will guide decisions on what investments will be made to purchase, build, and repair city infrastructure. Looking at key investments in this chart, you see that $17.6 billion, or 28% of our capital plan, is directed to water and wastewater infrastructure and stormwater investments, which is predominantly supported through water rate revenue and planned annual rate increases and has no reliance on tax-based funding. The city's highest investment of tax-based funding is in transit. At $17 billion, this represents 26% of the total capital plan. And with the considerable added investments made in this year's plan, has nearly surpassed Toronto Water as our largest area of capital investment. The city is also committed to spending $4.5 billion in housing, coupled with a further $4.5 billion in foregone revenue, provided to incentivize the development of affordable homes and rent-controlled homes. In addition, we continue to advocate for funding from other orders of government to further increase Toronto's housing supply. We're also investing a further $6.1 billion in transportation and mobility through investments in roads, in bridge repair, and in safety infrastructure. The city will also spend $5.2 billion on environment and recreation initiatives. This includes investments within parks, waterfront revitalization, environment and energy, as well as the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. Our large area of capital funding is from water rate revenue totaling $16.1 billion, which speaks to the success we have had in directing annual water rate increases to support investments in water infrastructure. Traditional tax-supported debt funding totals $10.5 billion, and while we've added debt funding this year, our debt service costs remain under 15% in each year of the plan. In addition to traditional tax-supported debt, the City Building Fund contributes $8.5 billion, or 14% of total capital investments, and is applied against transit and housing initiatives. Rounding out debt funding, we have about $1.6 billion funded through recoverable debt, which will be serviced through additional revenue sources generated through those capital investments. These three debt-related sources total over $20 billion, or 34% of all funding in the 10-year capital plan. Moving down the chart, development charges fund about $6.1 billion, or 10% of our total capital funding. These are dedicated to growth-related investments. Our capital plan also leverages enhanced funding partnerships with the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario, with total combined funding of $8 billion, reflecting over 13% of total capital funding. There's a further $3.6 billion in capital from current funding, and reserve funds, excluding draws from water, development charge, and city building fund reserves, account for $3.5 billion in capital funding. This level of funding is consistent with commitments against city reserves, where annual contributions are made, often through the operating budget, to support planned capital investments. An example includes fleet reserve contributions that support vehicle procurement plans in the capital budget. There is an added 1.5% levy increase specific to the capital program and for the City Building Fund, which will result in an annual increase of $58 for the average home, or the equivalent of $4.86 each month. Consistent with Council's endorsement in 2023 and how the 10-year capital plan was developed, an annual levy increase of 1.5% is expected each year until 2035 for the City Building Fund. And with the continued growth in the city's capital plan, the City Building Fund remains critical in supporting priority investments. The City Building Fund levy is specifically dedicated to support transit and housing investments in our capital plan, and in 2025, the City Building Fund is expected to generate $384 million in revenue. To date, $1.4 billion in investments have been spent or committed due to the City Building Fund, and as you heard in our previous slides, will support an additional $8.5 billion in capital investments over the next 10 years. As I mentioned earlier, the capital plan is increased by nearly $10 billion, or 20% compared to last year. About half of that increase has been directed towards investments in transit and transportation. For TTC alone, the capital plan is over $16 billion, about 34% increase from last year, and about 150% increase from a capital plan that was only $6.5 billion in 2018, which was just before the development of the TTC's original capital investment plan. With this added level of investment, supported by added funding from our partners in the federal and provincial governments, we're able to acquire 55 replacement subway cars for Line 2. $1.2 billion will be invested to purchase about 700 e-buses and 950 charging systems. $1 billion is being added for investments in both critical subway infrastructure repair, like signals, electrical and communication systems, and climate adaptation, resiliency, and efficiency measures. We're also adding $500 million to overhaul programs for buses, streetcars, and subways. At the same time, we're making added investments in transportation services with an added $380 million for city bridge and road rehabilitation. Consistent with what we heard from our residents, we're also investing an added $2 billion in housing and community improvements. This includes $400 million to advance data good repair efforts in our recreation facilities, $349 million in a combination of added direct investments and incentives to enable housing supply and build more affordable homes. We continue to invest in repairing TCHC buildings with an added $300 million investment in this year's plan. And we have also added a further $223 million to continue to advance our homelessness service capital infrastructure strategy. investments in stated good repair continue to be a city priority. 32.4 billion, or 54% of all planned capital spending over the next 10 years will be on stated good repair initiatives. This reflects an increase of $6 billion over what was identified in the 2024 capital plan. In fact, council has had to recently make some very tough decisions on where to invest in capital, and the prudent financial management that council has demonstrated has enabled the city to increase SOGR funding by 31% over the last 2 years alone. In addition to that, our SOGR investments have been informed by our capital asset management plan, with added investment in areas where our backlog was growing at a pace which was significantly greater than our level of investment. Based on this, we have prioritized SOGR funding in areas like transit, community housing, transportation, city facilities, and park and recreation infrastructure. On top of that, the City Building Fund has continued to help us further mitigate transit and housing SOGR pressures. And lastly, as a direct result of the Provincial New Deal, we've been able to remove the city's single largest SOGR liability in the form of the Gardiner Expressway and redirect $1.9 billion in funding relief to critical infrastructure renewal. As this slide demonstrates, the Gardiner upload has enabled us to redirect relief funding to other SOGR needs. Through this reallocation, we've been able to add $500 million to the TTC, $420 million to Parks, Forestry, and Recreation, $380 million to Transportation Services, $300 million to Toronto Community Housing, and $200 million to city facilities within our corporate real estate management budget. These also happen to be the program areas where, despite our ongoing efforts, our SOGR needs have been significantly outpacing our level of investment. Even with the added investments I've described, the city's SOGR backlog is still growing. We have a backlog of $9.4 billion at the end of 2024 that is expected to increase to $18 billion by 2034. However, with this year's added investment, not only do we see an initial decrease in our backlog, but we're starting to see the flattening of that growth curve. We're still expecting our backlog to grow by about $8.6 billion over the next 10 years, but that is a 29% decrease in our forecasted growth from this time last year. Not only does this added investment enable us to address critical backlog needs, but through this investment, we can enhance the reliability of our capital assets, reduce reactive maintenance costs, and with the cost escalation we've recently seen in our capital work, the earlier we can address required capital work, the less it will ultimately cost the city. This change demonstrates council's commitment to prioritizing SOGR investments, and we will continue to leverage all the tools and strategies available to us to seek further gains against our SOGR backlog moving forward. The capital plan also continues to be developed with a climate focus, and this year, projects have been prioritized using the new carbon budget prioritization process. The 10-year capital plan makes investments in climate mitigation and adaptation actions aimed at reducing about 161,000 tons of CO2 emissions, while also improving resiliency to climate change. Key actions across key sectors include buildings. As the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Toronto, the city is focused on reducing emissions from buildings to have a meaningful impact on the city's climate objectives. Mobility and fleet. There are a wide range of projects across the city divisions and agencies which positively contribute to the city's climate goals, including investments in bike share and TTC green bus procurement. Investments are also being made by our rate programs, including the basement flooding protection program and investments at the Dufferin Organics Processing Facility. And finally, there are other actions to achieve greater resiliency, including the Portland's flood protection project, stream restoration and erosion control, and enhanced green spaces. I'd also like to note that for the first time, we will be presenting on our citywide investments in climate action during our program reviews taking place this Wednesday, January 15th, and there'll be an ability to be able to speak to all of our climate change actions and be able to ask any of the questions detailed across citywide perspective. So, the City of Toronto was on a challenged financial path, which couldn't keep pace with the growing number of capital and operating pressures. As the economic engine of Ontario and Canada, the path we were on, the challenge we faced, were truly unique to Toronto. Torontonians have stepped up to do all they could, but it was clear that the city could not change direction alone or overnight. Now, as we enter the second year of our multi-year approach to budgeting, we are beginning down a new path that has already started to enhance our future financial stability. This year's operating budget of $18.8 billion maintains services and service levels while making key investments in areas we heard were most important to Torontonians, making life affordable, providing community services, getting Toronto moving, and keeping people safe. The 10-year capital plan of almost $60 billion continues to prioritize investments in state of good repair while making advancements in transit, housing, and community infrastructure. With the support of our federal and provincial partners, we've been able to increase our investments in critical capital infrastructure by almost 20% compared to last year, while still staying within our debt service limits. Because of this, we're starting to see the flattening of our SOGR growth curve and continuing to also advance our climate actions. Okay, there's a lot. So I'll just quickly run us through the budget schedule before I fully wrap things up. I'll take a moment to go over the upcoming dates that we have available. Later this week, from January 15th to 17th, you'll receive presentations from service areas and key agencies. The city will, for the second year now, be hosting telephone town halls, providing more opportunities for residents to participate in the budget process. These will happen in the evenings of January 15th and the 23rd and provide another opportunity to connect with our community. On February 21st and 22nd, I believe that's January, there will be another opportunity for the public to participate through deputations to the Budget Committee. On January 24th, we'll have a wrap-up Budget Committee meeting to review our future budget materials and answer any final questions that people may have. Then there will be a special City Council meeting on February 11th to discuss the budget following the Mayor's release of our final proposed budget by February 1st. We really do encourage people to get involved in the budget process. Following from the fall budget consultations, there are still opportunities to hear feedback and input from residents and businesses. This includes the telephone town halls that I just mentioned, speaking to Budget Committee on January 21st and 22nd, through written feedback to Budget Committee, or you can always contact your local councillor. With that said, thank you very much. I thank our Budget Chair, our Budget Committee members for your time this morning, and we look forward to continued discussions over the next month in support of the 2025 budget.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to go to questions. You'll note if you're looking at the paper copy, you've also got appendices of all those the great kind of slides that are great ways of communicating in your ward. We're not going to walk all the way through them, but they're there, and they're a huge help in doing your own ward town halls and e-blasts and such. So you've already got the start of your kit there. So to go to questions, I'm going to look for non-member questions. Some of the people have left who I thought had questions. Amongst non-members, do you have questions? Councillor Myers, I'm going to put Councillor Myers down, Councillor Crisanti, and then we'll take it in. If you are watching and waiting for question time, if you're watching from your office, we're taking questions from non-budget committee members right now, but I only have 2 on the list. And as always, remember today it's about the presentation that we just got. It's the overview presentation. So Councillor Myers, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I guess my first question is, you had mentioned the current property tax assessment is based on the 2016 valuations. Do we know when that will be updated? And will that update have an effect on our budget?
To the speaker, so I'm not certain when the next review will be done by MPAC. So there are conversations that are happening now. We continue to have dialogue with our partners. I'm still not certain when that will happen. I will caution, in terms of any changes in the assessed value of a property, it does not result in any additional revenue to the city. What you would see is you would see a shift potentially between properties or between classes, but it nets out to 0 change for the city. The way I like to explain it in simplest terms is if the average house property value increased by $100,000 and your house increased by $150,000, you'll probably be paying more. But if your house increased by 50,000, you're probably going to be paying less. And essentially, it nets out for the city, so there is no impact.
So the individual homeowners may see a decrease or increase, but for the city, it would be revenue neutral.
To the speaker, that's correct.
Thank you. And then I guess my next question is, what is the focus of 2025 budget? Like, what are the things that this budget is focused on improving? I sort of see a lot of things here, but in terms of if we had to explain it to the average person on the street, what are like the 2 or 3 things that this budget is really trying to tackle?
Sorry, there we go. To the speaker, I'll start with operating and then I'll touch on capital. I think in operating, first and foremost, is continuing down that multi-year approach to enhance fiscal sustainability. We have to get back to the place where our opening budget pressures are aligned with around a 700 to 800 million opening pressure. Just as important in that, and as we built the budget, it was around taking actions that both preserved and maintained services, but also made investments in those areas that we heard from the public that were most important. So we highlighted the 4 areas from keeping Toronto safe, addressing mobility, affordability. So those were very much a focus as we built this budget. So it was a combination both of going down that fiscal path while also preserving services and making key investments. On the capital side, I think you've probably heard me speak for many years now around the challenges with the growing backlog in capital. There has been an incredible focus, not just through this budget, but really over the last year and a half, to prioritize our investments in state good repair. As I mentioned in the presentation, we've had to make tough decisions. We've made tough decisions on investments in growth-related initiatives or service-related initiatives in capital. But what you see in this budget is really the results of those efforts and that prudent financial management, where we are starting to see some real change in that growth in our SOGR backlog.
Thank you. And then on page 17, 2025 balancing actions, line-by-line reviews, you have 93 million, and efficiencies, 41 million. Could you just go into, and program agencies and reviews, 294. Are those avoided costs or actual cuts?
To the speaker, so there is a combination of actions that are taken. So the efficiencies would be true cuts in actual expenditures. Those are where we were found opportunities or options to continue to provide the services we provide, but at a reduced cost. Line by line would be a combination. For the most part, when we're looking at line by line, we're looking at each expenditure category and even down to the commitment items. We'll look over the last 5 years in terms of what programs have actually spent compared to the budget allotments they've had, and we might actually reduce the budget or we would reduce some of the expectations that are included in the budget. In terms of programs and agency reviews, those are more of us playing a challenge function. For the most part, that would be cost avoidance, not actual reductions in the budgets that you would see in prior years. So those would be the major areas that we looked at on the expenditure side.
And have the cuts have any direct impact on services delivered?
To the speaker, the focus on this year's budget was bringing forward a balanced budget that preserved or maintained services. There are no material changes that you will see in terms of services that are being driven by budget decisions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Councillors, I have the clock, but it's part of the hybrid meeting effect that we don't have the clock there for you, so I am keeping the 5-minute time. Councillor Crisanti, just before you start, I forgot that Councillor Chernos Lynn is on virtually. Did you have any questions, Councillor Chernos Lynn?
And I'm just trying to figure out how I request to be put on that list.
Okay. When we're in a committee room, it's low tech. You basically turn your camera on and wave at me.
Okay, all right, so my camera's on.
Hi
If
there.
you can put me at the bottom of the list, though, I'm fine with that.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, it's a short list of non-members. Councillor Crisanti's going to ask questions. I haven't seen anybody else come in. So he's going to take another 5 minutes. If you want, I can go through the budget committee members and you can listen to their questions first. That's a courtesy I think we can afford you since this is your first budget.
Some of them may get answered in that process, so happy to do that. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay, Councillor Crisanti, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, Chair. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. And Good morning to you as well, and for your presentation. Look, I know that there's a tremendous amount of effort and work that goes into every year when we do our budget. And we also recognize how critical, important it is, not only to Torontonians, taxpayers, the City of Toronto, to our city staff, everyone. So it's challenging, and thank you for all the work that you've done on this. I'll just start with that. Now, as far as, I just want to get some clarity along the lines of, I'm going to refer back to slide 19, where you speak to keeping people safe, and there's 276 additional emergency service positions, fire, police, paramedics. Slide 9, alternatives, has some different numbers that don't add up to the numbers on page 19. I'm wondering if we could reconcile that, or maybe we can explain that.
Sure. To the speaker. Slide 9, I'm going to go off memory, I believe, is the results of the investments that were made in the 2024 budget. So through the actions that were made in the 2024 budget, I'm just going to confirm that that is in fact slide 9. It is, great, good memory. So those are the actions and investments that we made through the 2024 budget. Those are increases in approved positions that are already in place today, where we've added staffing in fire, paramedics, and the police. What you see in the investments that we include in the operating section are further investments that we're making in emergency services in 2025. So really, the true benefit is the combined impact of both what you see in slide 9 and what you see in the operating section.
Sorry, say again, combined impact of slide 9.
And slide 19. So those would be the
Slide
increases
19.
in emergency services that are being made over 2 years.
So if we have funded the police to the tune of $43 million, I believe?
I believe it's 46 off memory.
46 million? That will allow police services to have 4 full recruitment classes, correct?
To the speaker, the 46 million in funding we're providing to the police services really does 2 things.
Yeah.
It not only allows them to bring forward 4 recruitment classes this year to increase their complement as part of the multi-year hiring strategy, it also allows them to fund the annualization of the positions that were added last year, as they don't all start on January 1st. So it enables us to fully fund those positions that would have come through the classes in the prior year.
So how many, what's the total capacity per class?
So the police can probably answer it better than I can off memory. I believe we have about 90 slots available within each of our, the 4 classes in the year.
No, that's good. Again, I'm trying to reconcile the numbers. So that's 90 times 4 is 360, correct? Here it says 307 police added, so we're going to do better than that.
So it's an interesting piece. When you're looking at the complement for police, it's a little tricky. So what we look at is the authorized uniform strength on our streets. The classes themselves, there's a lag essentially from when an officer or a cadet in training enters into the classes, goes through the process, which I believe is 3 or 4 months, does additional training when they're on the force itself before they're considered as part of the authorized uniform strength, which is why you tend to see a lag in the impact on their staffing, usually into the following year. So you will see this year 90 officers in 4 classes throughout the year.
Okay. And I know we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and department by department, agency by agency over the next few days. So if I could ask, when you indicate here on slide 19 again, investments in youth violence prevention programs, is that outlined somewhere what that really means and what type of investment and what kind of programs? Can you direct me to where I can find that information exactly? Or can you speak to it in general?
Yeah, to the speaker. So there is a focus, and part of what we've heard from the public is not only investing in emergency services, but investing in root causes of violence and violence prevention. So what we've done through this year's budget is we've made a fund available. It has not yet been fully allocated. There's going to be reviews and processes that are going to happen throughout the year. We'll work with community partners. We'll identify opportunities to allocate those funds to the best use.
Okay. I'm running out of time. One last question quickly, and I know that I may have to dwell on this a little bit further when the TTC does have their day, and I see the chair is here with us today too, so I'll likely be back for that. Fare evasion, Somewhere here I read that due to some additional effort that we're going to make to help mitigate fare evasion, can you speak to that? How much will we be saving, do you think, moving forward on that? Given that we're at $140 million in fare evasion currently, and that's a pretty big, serious number.
Yeah, and to the chair, so definitely an area I would encourage you to ask questions of the TTC when they come in. I can say when we met with them through the review process, this was an area that we flagged and we highlighted. We were looking at revenue realization measures and what could be done to be able to capture revenue to then reinvest back into the service. So there are actions that the TTC is bringing forward to be able to mitigate the impact of fare evasion. They can speak to the exact number. I might have just received the text. I think it was 12 million. Yes, it was $12 million was the amount that was captured.
But you don't know what the action is offhand?
So there's various actions. They could probably speak to it better than I could.
Councillor Grisanti, that really gets down into a level of detail where we don't have the team here to
come back to
answer.
that, Chair.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
yeah, thank you.
And as you've pointed out, because it was such a topic, the chair can probably give you a fair amount of information right off the bat. Okay, thank you. I see that. Councillor Holiday, you could help spend some time. Councillor Turnos Lynn wants to listen to all of our questions first. Did you want to ask questions?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay,
I
go
have been
ahead.
listening intently on YouTube and taking the opportunity to jump online here. To Mr. Conforti, I wondered if you could just elaborate on how you've come up with the concept of capital from current and how you've set the number. Because I do note, I think it's 6% of the capital plan.
To the speaker, so capital from current continues to be a funding source that we leverage and rely on to support our capital plan. I believe the number, and I'm just trying to find the slide, is around 300 million or so is the amount that supports our capital program. The number is generally unchanged from past years. For those of you that have been at the city for a while, there was a program that was in place probably 10 or 15 years ago where we were continuing to increase it by 10% a year to get to an ultimate goal. It was done to be able to support our capital investments while mitigating the reliance on debt issuance. We've now reached that, and the go-forward approach is essentially increasing it more in line with a couple of % a year, and that continues to be a source we use to fund our capital infrastructure.
Could you just expand a little bit on it? Is it literally cash flow over from the property tax?
Yeah, thank you. It is quite literally where we support capital initiatives directly from operating funding. So essentially, property tax-based funding goes directly to support capital initiatives on a pay-as-you-go approach rather than issuing debt.
So do we have an obligation to spend that much money, or how do you come up with that number? And how do you come up with a number that's proportionate to the other funding sources that contribute to our capital plan?
So the number we're at today was really part of that multi-year strategy that had been embarked on probably 10 or 15 years ago. We've now hit that threshold. We aren't increasing it. There are obviously affordability challenges with being able to continue to go higher and do more on that. I will say it is leveraged. We look at it and use it specifically on investments within our capital program where you may have less of a useful life, where it's not as advantageous for us to issue 10, 20, or 30-year debt. So that's where the determination is made in terms of its allocation. But in terms of the total amount, it's really the results of that longer-term strategy that had been implemented a few years back.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, my timer's not running, but I'll just ask one other question that is of interest, and it's conceptual.
Yeah, you have time, Councillor. I'm sorry, the clock's working for me, but we're not able to broadcast it out. But you're only at 2.5 minutes. You got time for a couple more.
Okay. Well, again, to Mr. Conforti, and forgive me because I don't have the paper in front of me, but there was a discussion on the capital side that related to foregone revenue. And if I remember correctly, it was in and around $4 billion over 10 years. And I wondered two things. Could you tell me a little bit more about how that foregone revenue impacts the capital plan over those 10 years? Is it loaded towards the front, towards the rear, or is it linear? And secondly, what is the impact of that foregone revenue otherwise on the plan? So not only has it been recognized as a contribution towards the program, but it also, I think, puts pressure on other elements of the capital plan. In other words, we can't do things because of the foregone revenue, or we have to make up the money in a different way to fund those elements. Could you tell me a little bit more about how to read and understand the foregone revenue in the context of a capital plan?
Sure, and to the speaker, so the amount of foregone revenue that's identified is $4.5 billion. That's essentially two major components, and it's all attributed towards housing supply and affordable housing. So we have an affordable housing program where we waive certain fees, provided we meet affordable housing criteria. That could be fees associated with development applications, other applications that come into the city that support that. So those would be impacted on the operating budget, not the actual capital budget. And as we built our operating budgets, we've generally built them where there is a level of tax subsidy built into the city planning budget or other supporting budgets to be able to achieve those outcomes. The other area that we see foregone revenue is generally within development charge relief. So provided affordability measures are being met, we would either completely waive development charges, or as part of our recent housing incentives report, we would waive a portion of our development charges to be able to help incentivize further development and address some of the housing challenges that we've seen today. With regards to the DC loss, it's something that we model. It's actually something that we even tend to build into our background study in a way where we're reviewing the impact of that loss such that it doesn't have an immediate or direct impact on the existing capital program. And that was what we'd come forward with the housing incentives report. What was being offered up, and I believe it was around $210 million in further incentives. We were able to make that change. That was essentially the amount we can make without it having a negative impact on our capital program.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're going to let Councillor Chernos listen to all the questions because she's the only person in this grouping for whom it's not a first time. So she's just going to see if some of the questions get addressed and then ask what remains for her. Councillor McKelvey, did you have questions?
I do, Chief, thank you. So my first questions are around motions that we brought forward last year, asking you to find further efficiencies, specifically around rolling program reviews, engagement with management and employees. So can you tell us what was done and what you found?
Sure, to the speaker. So there's a few actions that we've taken, so I'll try to get into each of them. The first are on the rolling program review. So we initiated work on the rolling program review following last year's budget. We started our initial review really within the city with transportation and PF&R, and our teams were working with them to identify what are opportunities, what are actions that could then be part of the submission for consideration through the process. We also internally had a lens, and I spoke to it earlier, I believe with Councillor Crisanti, around revenue realization within the TTC and some actions that we could take when we were meeting with the TTC on driving some of the revenue realization. Again, those were factored in our program reviews and ultimately changes that would have been included in our submission. The other piece that I'll note, and it's not operating, but it's capital, and I spoke to it, there was also a very strong focus on prudent financial management in the capital budget. So through the work that we were doing, supported by our capital asset management plan and our capital prioritization framework, we were quite actually able to avoid hundreds of millions in capital expenditures in initiatives that were really growth focused or service improvement focused. And instead, it enabled us to see the increase that you're seeing in the state of good repair backlog, or the addressing the state of good repair backlog. So those were some of the actions that we took on the rolling program review side. Beyond that, the directions that we provided really in two forms. One was the budget submission directions, had a real focus on uncovering and finding both reductions and efficiencies. And both Althea, our Executive Director of Financial Planning, and myself did a bit of a traveling roadshow amongst our areas in the city, bringing that message forward. The other thing that we did, and we issued this in September, was there was a discretionary memo that was sent out from the two of us, a discretionary spending memo, where we asked, beginning in September, to hold off on discretionary spending, but then to also factor that into the budget submission. That was in areas of uniforms and cleaning, areas of materials, office supplies, furniture and fixtures, and business travel. And within the memo itself, we actually highlighted what we would call the commitment items, where you would find those expenses in SAP to try to drive those savings forward. All of these actions were ultimately what factored into the $680 million in reductions and offsets that were brought forward in the budget. So that includes $41 million in efficiencies, $93 million in line-by-line reviews, and even some of the program challenge functions that we provided. In terms of employee feedback, a little more informal on the employee feedback, but it was part of the directions that we gave. I can speak to my own example in Finance and Treasury Services, where based on the feedback that we received from our groups, I got an idea from our procurement team around embedding early payment discounts into our procurement awards. It's not something we can implement overnight. Before you can achieve an early payment discount, you actually have to pay on time. So we're working with our accounts payable team, setting up that process longer term to be able to achieve that. But it's also recognized, if you look at corporate services, and I'm going to look to David Jollymore just to my right, really you saw a focus on efficiencies in their group, within technology services, within fleet services, that are really driving home some of the savings that we've identified. It was all part of those discussions and directions that we would have given based on what we had heard last year.
Thank you. So does that get at kind of this end of year, if you don't use it, you can't get it next year amount? Is it addressing that?
That's the aim. You know, it's not something that's solved overnight. I think this is something that all organizations deal with, but it is the aim. And you know, we do have strategies and tools that looks at expenditures on a calendarized basis, enabling us to actually pinpoint some of those discretionary spending that you see in the later months, which was why that memo was issued in September, purposely to try to avoid that.
One of the things that we also asked for was working on culture to celebrate projects coming in on time, on budget, under budget. You started to get at that, but how are you kind of formalizing that?
Yeah, to the speaker, I'd say probably for the most part, you see a lot of that on capital this year. So outside of us giving direction on the operating side, I do think capital, we've made a really strong effort, not just to drive change in terms of where we make tough decisions, but at least internally to celebrate the successes that we've seen. And it's something you see even in today's budget presentation, where we're highlighting the impact on SOGR. And it's something we continue to take back at our leadership tables when we meet with our divisions and trying to.
And I'm going to squeak one in super fast. Where did you come in terms of budget last year? Were you on budget, overall operating under budget? And where will there be a budget briefing note on reserves?
To the speaker, we can get the exact number. I think our projected variance on the operating budget, I'm going to look at Althea, I think it was around 110 to 120 million was our projected. It was really driven by TTC, some of the savings, early savings that we saw in our shelters group, and some of our investment returns. All of that has been factored into what you see in this budget. In terms of a briefing note on reserves, that is a briefing note that we prepare every year. It's either available today or it's going to be finalized in the next day or two and will be available.
So any rollover from last year goes up against helping keep this year's property tax rate?
Yeah, so what you see as part of our budget bridging strategy is just that. We look at the funds, and we've created newly last year the budget bridging and balancing reserve, which is that specific purpose. We'll take any underspending that we achieve, allocate it into that reserve, and then look at a phased approach to be able to draw that back, which is consistent with us getting our opening pressures down to that $700 to $800 million range in the next few years.
Okay, Councillor Moyes, are you ready to go?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Through you, Madam Chair. On page 12, you mentioned budget challenges. I know you've gone into some details about some of these challenges point by point, but the one thing I don't see here is the challenges around those who are underhoused. We have a lot of pressures of people who are underhoused in our parks and in our city. I saw AMO put out a report last week, around 80,000 people in the province are underhoused, and it's going to rise to 300,000 people in a very short period of time. What steps are we taking in this budget so that we don't have the same issue year after year in trying to find housing for people?
to the speaker, and that was the intent. So when we looked at the budget challenges, there's really two categories that I would consider that would fall in. One was growing demand for city services, but more importantly on the far right, shelter and social support pressures. So on the operating side, that continues to be a challenge. That continues to be a priority area in terms of where we make investments. I'd also say on the capital side, it's an area where you see probably the most significant growth over time in terms of where we've added funds. You see it both in our investments within affordable housing, housing supply initiatives, but even the added investments that we're making within TCHC around building repairs, the added investments we're making within our shelter infrastructure plan. So it continues to be a focus in both of our budgets.
I'll add, Chair, that we're also working with the federal government to achieve the additional investments that they announced in their budget last April around encampment funding support. So we'll be investing those resources to enhance our ability to work in encampments. And this budget does also maintain the massive increase we've had in the number of beds in our shelter system. So what you see is a cumulative approach on our budget of ensuring that those bed counts don't go down. And as we are seeing more of an exit through the application of the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit, particularly of refugee and asylum seekers from our shelter system, those beds in our base system become available to help us deal more proactively with encampments.
Okay, thank you. And in regards to the TTC and the new railway cars coming into for Line 2, was that contract signed or was that just a promissory note by the feds?
So, Chair, the federal government have committed those funds. The Permanent Transit Fund, I forget exactly what it's called now, but it was called the Permanent Transit Fund. That is a funding source that's been through their Treasury Board process. So that is, those allocations have gone not only to the City of Toronto, but also to other municipalities. So those funds are in place, and that is how they're funding their commitment. So the partial amount of the Permanent Transit Fund, which will be there year over year, is what is allowing the TTC to move forward with those purchases. So I'm not sure what contracts per se have been signed, but the funding source itself is a approved one. I'd equate it to their housing funding, which we receive regularly. Again, approved funds that are there.
Thank you. And also too, on line page 23, you touched around solid waste management services, and there will be an increase of 3.75% for water and waste management. If my memory serves me correctly, I know that there's some changes coming to the recycling program in the City of Toronto, where it'll be a private company that'll be taking that over. I think that's direction from the province. How does that square with that initiative? Is this simply, is this for garbage or is this for recycling or both? Just for my own clarification.
To the speaker, so what we have in front of us is the overarching solid waste rate. It's generally charged against your waste bin. So either your small, medium, large, or extra.
So not recycling.
We've never charged against recycling. It's always been charged against the waste bin. I will say, in terms of the extended user responsibility, which I believe is what you're referring to, that had been factored and modeled into multi-year planning, at least back to a couple of years ago. So the budgets that were presented both last year, this year, and even going forward have already started to factor in the assumptions that come along with that, obviously getting modified or adjusted as required. And I'm sure our general manager of solid waste can speak to it in better detail than I can.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's a phased approach, that's probably best for the review day.
Okay, thank you. I'm at time.
That's it? Okay, thank you. Councillor Chang, are you ready?
Thank you, through the chair. I'm just wondering, what is the estimated inflationary impact on the proposed property tax increase? So what percentage of that increase can be accounted for by the inflationary pressure on the city's budget?
To the speaker, I'm not sure I've broken it out specifically on various inflation factors. We tend to look at it in terms of program drivers. I'd also note that our inflation factors vary. It would depend on the expenditure type. I think generally we're seeing inflation anywhere from 2.5% to 3% across a lot of our services, but we're seeing higher rates if it's inflation associated with construction, We also have different rates associated with collective agreements. So we tend to look at the different drivers in terms of what is, where and how the property tax increase is addressing those drivers that we see in the budget.
In 2024, there was reduced real estate activity, and I'm wondering what was the difference between our estimated land transfer tax and what we actually received?
To the speaker, there was. Fortunately, we had anticipated a reduction. We still have not met our budget amounts. I'll have to dig up the actual variance amount off memory. I think it's around 30 million or so that we would be underachieving our total revenue. I will say there was an expectation that we were going to see reduced activity. So a couple of years back, we changed how we use land transfer tax revenue, and it's something that continues to be included in our budget today, where only about 750 million of the expected land transfer tax revenue was directed to operations. What we did was every dollar above that was directed into a reserve that would support future capital work, giving us the ability to mitigate the impact that might come about with volatility in the market. In the year where we actually achieved over $1.1 billion, we were even able to set aside a bit of those funds as part of a contingency to manage that volatility. So closing out last year's budget, even though we were reduced below our already reduced budget estimate, it doesn't have a material impact on our operations or our ability to manage our capital program.
So are we forecasting a continued slowing down, or what is the plan for this year's budget?
Yeah, to the speaker, so we are expecting there to be some growth in our land transfer tax revenue. We take that step cautiously, but we've started to see some increased activity in the leading drivers that you would see associated with home sales. We're also seeing the decline in the Bank of Canada rate that reduces interest rates, with the expectation through our discussions with our partners and financial institutions that we'll continue to see those come down, which could drive further home sales. That being said, it's also coupled with, actually, on top of it, the introduction of a couple of new tools that came from the long-term financial plan. So the graduated rate for higher value homes, as well as the non-resident speculation tax. So all of those combined, we are expecting increased revenue. That said, with that increase, we're being very careful in terms of not much of it is going to be directed to support operations. A lot of it is going to be set aside into a capital reserve where we can measure what the actual experience this year is and manage that if it's not fully achieved.
Thank you. On page 21, there's a differentiation between residential and multi-residential. Can you just explain what that difference is? Are people in condos charged differently, or what's a multi-residential?
To the speaker, so residential, a condo would be part of a residential home. Single detached would be part of a residential. Essentially, if you are in a home or a property that has 7 units or more, you would move into the multi-residential property class.
Okay. So is that,
But rental only. 7 units or more rented.
7 units or
not
more rental. Thank you for the clarification. Those would essentially be our rental properties of 7 units or more.
so last year we talked about doing a review of some divisions using practices like Lean Six Sigma to further efficiencies and agility in our city. I'm wondering, what is the status of that? Are there some star divisions that have gone through some processes and we've seen some leanness come out of that?
To the chair, yeah, so there were, and some of these were the examples that I explained when Councillor McKelvey asked me a question around some of the actions last year. So there were a series of actions that we've taken in terms of reviewing discretionary expenses, line-by-line reviews, but definitely a focus on trying to achieve efficiencies. What you'll see this year at about 41 million in efficiencies, it's considerably greater than what we've generally achieved every year. It's usually in the 20 to 30 million range that we've been able to achieve. I am going to call out a couple of programs because I think it's important to do so and really encourage more opportunities of this going forward. Our shelter services were able to renegotiate hotel contracts and achieve very significant savings. Within corporate services, we were able to achieve really a review of our software and system applications and either completely decommissioning or renegotiating contracts. Fleet Services identified a series of reviews. I mentioned a couple of them in the presentation, retreading of tires, underutilized vehicles. So there were a few areas that really did focus in on some opportunities, and we get to experience, benefit from that in an amount of savings that's almost equivalent to a 1% property tax increase.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Perks, did you want to go?
Yeah, sure. In his questions, Councillor Holliday was focusing on the foregone revenue having to do with housing incentives. Well, I took his point. I'm wondering if in creating these incentives, we're looking at the avoided costs of providing shelter to those individuals and how those costs compare.
Chair, I mean, we haven't done the accounting of that, but very much so in reflecting on the direction we were given, which was to come back with some things that could help spur that development. That was our thinking. I mean, you're seeing the City of Toronto, through your direction and ultimate approval, taking some steps that we've not taken before as a city. So that doesn't come lightly. And some of it is, we need to build this housing. Right now, it is a market in which the regular incentives of the City of Toronto don't work. They did work for a long time. We needed to have more incentives to make that happen. And part of it is that if we stall that, then two things are going to happen. One is just affordability in general gets worse, which we want to try and stunt. But the second piece, for those who need it most, it is a shelter system. A shelter system which has grown from just when I started with the City of Toronto in 2021 from about 6,000 shelter beds to now over 10,000 shelter beds. That is a cost in your budget that you can see year over year as an increase. So while we haven't absolutely given a chart that shows the difference of that, it did factor into our decision making, and that was a prudent investment of foregone revenues in order to achieve multiple goals, not just the reduction of a charge per se to build housing.
So when you say prudent, the annual cost of foregone revenue to put someone in a home is less than the annual cost of sheltering that individual. Am I remembering that right? I think it was actually quite substantial.
Yeah, Chair, I mean, the reality is it is always cheaper to find housing for an individual than to have them exist, particularly for long periods of time in a shelter system. We want that shelter system to be there for short time frames when people need extra assistance. When people are living quite literally in our shelter system, it is $60,000 plus. I know Abby would have the exact number and Gord would have the exact number, but we're talking about just a ridiculous sum of money being paid to do something that we can do much more effectively with housing. Better outcomes for people, better outcomes financially.
Better outcomes financially. So when I look at this foregone revenue, I should have in mind avoided cost.
Chair, yes, absolutely. And I think the other piece is the prudentness of it is we've put timeframes around this for review. This is not a new way of moving it. Both the units are capped, but also we're going to review these as it changes. If the financial situation changes, we may adjust again what those incentives look like.
Thank you.
And the reason I had you go next is so that I can ask you to chair. I have, I'm just gonna step out for a second, but I have Councillor Morley and then Councillor Turnos.
Okay. Councillor Morley, or Deputy Mayor Morley.
Thank you so much. Through the chair, thank you for the great presentation and the incredible amount of work. Curious about the status of multi-year operating plan development. We heard about some of the successes that we're now seeing because multi-year strategies work. So can you talk to us a little bit more about the multi-year operating plan development?
To the Vice Chair. Yeah, absolutely. So as we mentioned in the presentation, it really began in earnest last year as we were facing a $1.8 billion pressure and not a pressure you could address in a single year without drastic changes in critical city services or very high property tax rate increases. So the idea was to build a multi-year journey that was really supported by council direction on the long-term financial plan. So what you've seen in the long-term financial plan, and we will have a briefing note that will be available on this, we'll talk about all of the actions that we've already implemented and the work that is underway to continue to bring forward actions that were approved by council. The intent is those actions coupled with continuing to drive for reductions, offsets, efficiencies, can slowly offset those temporary bridging strategies or reserve draws that are being done in a planned, phased approach, in amounts that we're able to slowly reverse out through the actions that would come online. So again, this was essentially the strategy. It did require us to have an enhanced view and longer-term view on other initiatives we're taking, growth pressures we're taking. But we are going down the path, and you see it this year with the opening pressure of $1.2 billion. You see it next year with a pressure of over $1 billion. And most importantly, if we can continue down this path, getting by 2027 to an opening pressure that's going to be in around that 700 to 800 million range, which would help me sleep a lot better at night. So what's also important, it's easy enough for me to talk about this strategy, but was really, what gave me a lot of satisfaction was when we met with our credit rating agencies, it was actually something that was highlighted, and it was actually given as one of the rationales in terms of the credit rating increase that we saw this year, the first time we saw a credit rating increase in decades. And they did specifically note both the city's prudent financial management, but bringing forward this multi-year plan that is working.
Thank you.
Last thing I'll add in terms of the value of this work is that from an intergovernmental perspective, our conversations become much easier and stronger when we can show the view. If you only take a one-year budget and you're saying, here's what we need based on last year only, the question that could come back to us is, well, what is the projected plan? Is this exactly what you need forever? Because as we exited the pandemic, of course, our needs were a little bit greater. So I think the rigor that we're taking with these multi-year plans allows us to have a stronger conversation with the provincial and federal governments about how they can assist us to deal with the systemic problems that we're going to face in years to come.
Thank you, and a helpful segue, because my next question is specifically with respect to those intergovernmental conversations and the New Deal 2.0. I think Torontonians, certainly this council, were quite thrilled to see the impact and some of the outcomes of previous discussions. We've heard about the alleviation of the pressure from the Gardiner upload, and so I wonder if you could talk to us a bit more about what our priorities are for that 2.0 conversation and what we anticipate, and I know it's hard to say, but what potential impacts we might see on the 25 budget based on the New Deal 2.0 conversations.
So Vice Chair, let's start from where we need to start with. I very rarely get scared by things, but last year there was a fear of what we would have to do to services if there wasn't that partnership. Right. So we can't stress enough the work of the mayor and the premier, this council, the staff that helped do the details in terms of how this has helped us ensure that we can maintain services. Moving forward, the conversations will be in some ways very similar. Our core systemic issues don't change. The New Deal gave us 3 years of runway. There won't be a lot new in 2025 or into 2026. We have shelter funding that will be sustained over those 3 years. For instance, our investments in transit will be there. Now, as Finch and Eglinton Crosstown come online, we'll do that reconciliation of what those investments will look like. But that's very static. Our focus is beyond 2026. Mm-hmm. When those investments expire in terms of the operating budget, they need to be sustained in some way. And those areas are going to remain, as you've seen for years and will continue to see. We have a transit pressure that is unique to Toronto. We have a housing and homelessness pressure that is unique to Toronto. We have some pressures within our emergency services that are unique to Toronto, and we'll be adding that, I think, to some of our discussions as well. And then, of course, we'll look at ways that we can work together better with the provincial government to make some things, the provincial and federal government in terms of land, in terms of ways that we might work together differently in accessing even financing. Those are the ways that we can partner to achieve better outcomes together. But in terms of the core fundamentals of what will need to be in place by our budget for 2027, they remain largely unchanged.
If I can sneak in one more quick one,
Sure.
Thank you. Just with respect to our agency partners and divisions, we talked about, we know they are the, they are the engine that makes this whole thing work. In getting to alignment in the staff budget, I know in previous years, in my experience, we weren't always quite there when we got to this point, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to provide any context or color in terms of the work that's been done over this past year, the priorities and alignment with our agency partners and divisions, or do we expect any fights ahead of us? That's my last question.
To the chair, great question, and we haven't always been in alignment. There's been differences between the budget that's proposed and those that have been approved by the board in the past. I will say that is not the case this year. We've actually had a very positive working relationship with our board, our counterparts in our agencies. Especially if you look at the larger agencies, you're going to see a TTC budget that is very much aligned with what we have today, a police budget that's aligned, a library budget where we're making investments, even our Toronto Community Housing budget where there is an alignment between what we're bringing forward today. So really universally across our agencies, very productive relationships that have happened this year to be able to bring forward this year's budget with consistent alignment.
Great work. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay. Councillor Chernos, Lynn, that brings us to the end of the member questions. Did you have any questions still?
I do.
Go ahead.
So, thank you, Chief. So, through the chair, my first question is with respect to the TTC. I'm sorry, I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Are you hearing an echo?
No, that happens on WebEx sometimes. Just make sure all the microphones are off, folks.
Okay, so at least you aren't hearing it. And actually now I don't hear it. So thank you for whatever you did on your end. My first question is with respect to TTC, one of the things that we heard, well, I've heard so much from constituents, and I know we've heard about over the last year, is significant concern about the quality of the experience for TTC riders and a reluctance of some to use it based on issues around reliability, but also around the social challenges that people are experiencing on the TTC and a lack of feeling safe. And so I wondered, how does this budget address that? And my second part to that question is, staff have chosen not to recommend a fare increase. And I wondered if staff could just explain their thinking around that. Thank you.
To the chair, so I'll begin. I would suggest it's probably helpful to ask these questions as well when we have our program reviews with TTC staff, who can probably speak to them better than I can. The first, as it relates to a fare increase, just cautioning in terms of city staff do not have the authority to propose a fare increase. That's a decision that's made actually through the commission itself. So that would be something that would come forward as part of the commission discussions. I will say, and as we built this budget, consistent with what we heard around affordability, transit was one of the areas that we heard around the need around affordability, which is likely part of the input that would have gone into the decision not to raise the fares that you've seen this year, consistent with not raising them last year as well. In terms of reliability, there are added investments that we're making. There's added investments in service hours, but 500,000 additional service hours across various modes to ensure that we've got the service that meets the demands that we're seeing as we are starting to see our ridership continue to grow back to the levels that we would have seen prior to the pandemic. In addition to that, we know that there's been challenges around bunching and gapping. So there's some pilot initiatives that are included in this year's budget to be able to support that and to bring initiatives forward. You'll also note that last year there were some investments that were made in collaboration with the province around different initiatives around safety aspects within the transit system. So that was something that was introduced in last year's budget. The other piece I'll note in terms of reliability, this is the largest investment that we've made in the TTC's capital budget, not just ever, but even the increase is probably only equivalent to the increase from when there was some changes with the provincial government around upload of transit expansion projects. At over $16 billion, it really highlights where we need to make investments, and you're going to see this with the Line 2 subway cars, which were a real challenge in terms of some of the reliability aspects. It's not going to be something that gets addressed overnight, but through our investments in staggered repair, through our investments in new technology and system and signal work, it will also have a direct benefit that you see on the reliability of the system in years to come.
Yeah, Councillor, when TTC presents later this week, some of the social work approach community services that are on the system and such, they can break down in much greater detail. Yeah.
Okay, great. On the slide deck that we saw earlier, I think it was number 4 in things that were important to those who were surveyed and gave feedback was traffic. And so obviously TTC is part of that. If we have more people taking public transit or bikes, we know there's less cars on the road. And I appreciate in this budget that you've added a large number of people to help at intersections as traffic monitors, I think they're called, which is great. But I also wondered where in the line by line item would I find the revenue that we generate from fees that developers pay for closing down a lane of traffic?
To the speaker, I believe that would be the lane occupancy fee that I believe is collected within the transportation services budget.
Okay.
And I don't have the exact details. I'd have to circle back with transportation staff.
Yeah, today is primarily for questions of the presentation. The details behind really will happen Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday when the actual deputy city manager and the general managers of each of these come forward to present the detail within each division. And that one is really getting down there into the detail.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and so with respect to that, then can I also ask who would I ask about the court services one? What does that come under?
Well, court services will be presenting. They'll be one of the departments that presents in each of the days, and this is in the budget committee agenda. What you'll see is the cluster that's presenting, and then each of those divisions will be here. Pardon me. And available to answer questions. We hear from the deputy city manager of that cluster, and then we ask division by division, are there questions here, 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 and here, and go through them. They're long days, but they're fun.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. That's it for me then.
Oh, okay. Okay, is that it? That's it for questions? If I could ask the indulgence of the committee, Councillor Crisanti has a follow-up question. I'm hoping it won't generate an entire second round, but just one more question. Is that fair? Okay, thanks, guys. Go ahead, Councillor Crisanti.
Thank you, Chair. I did have a couple, but I'll try and do it as quickly as I could. I just wanted to go back to your presentation when you spoke to the average property tax increase and what that would look like. And that was referenced based on the assessed value. What is the average property tax itself in the City of Toronto? Do you have a number for that? Actual average property tax, not assessed value, a property tax that people pay?
So in 2024, the average property tax based on an assessed value of $692,000.
Based on that?
Based on that was just under $3,900. With the increases in the levy for both the operating budget and the city building fund, that increases to $4,160.
Okay, I'll likely want to discuss that offline with you because I'm getting different numbers. Okay, the next question is with respect to slide 9. That speaks to two things, the food program and the rent bank. What are the costs associated for those two items? Rent bank and food?
To the speaker, I apologize, I don't have the backup on the amount of dollars that were invested in those initiatives. And again, these were the initiatives invested in 2024. You have similar investments that are in the budget in 2025 as well, and they would be included within the enhancement section within each of the program areas that are provided.
So we could, again, look at it again offline a little more. However, would you agree, though, that, you know, when it comes to, and it's so critical that our children are fed and they go to school, you know, that are already fed, and there are issues related to why some of these things don't happen. Isn't this a provincial responsibility, and are we getting provincial support for supporting programs such as these?
Chair, we do receive provincial support, or these programs are cost-shared programs. They're not 100% owned by other orders of government. I think the point you're making is one that we repeatedly make, which is we have a tension every year. We know what is impacting Torontonians, and we want to provide those services. The reality is, though, that there aren't increasing resources sometimes from other orders of government. Now, there are in certain areas, but we're choosing to make additional investments around rent bank programs and school-based food programs. But there are also provincial dollars and/or federal dollars that flow, and we continue to ask for better support around those programs on a regular basis.
Well, that's good. I agree that we should. Did you have another response there, Steve, for that?
To the speaker, so I have been able to identify some of the dollars. In terms of expanding the student nutrition program, we have added $6 million, is included in this year's budget. And I'm sure I have the rent bank here, but I'd have to pull that one out and find it on the list.
Yeah, those will be in the detailed breakdowns.
I would love to get that $6 million back from the province. That's where it should be coming from. Last question, Chair, and thank you for the indulgence, and is respect to the 100 traffic agents. And only because the numbers, I'm sorry, don't add up in my mind. You get 100 divided by the, 3 million by 100 is about, they got to be earning more than $30,000 a year. So that either tells me that it's not actually 100 or they are earning $30,000 a year.
To the speaker, it's neither. So it's, what it is it's the phasing of when they would be hired and come on. So like we will do with any new position, especially a position approved through the budget, you wouldn't expect that position to be hired and online in January 1st. So what we do is we work with the program areas around the pace and speed at which they can bring them on and hire once there is a budget approval. And then we budget based on the cost for 2025, and the full year cost would get reflected in the following year.
So it's likely not 100 agents this year. It's a longer term plan to get 100.
Oh, and I believe in total, it's an additional 25 positions. I can look, it's about 25 positions. Again, at this point last year, we had about 25 active traffic agents. There was an approval approved as part of last year's budget. You're now starting to see over the course of the year that those agents are coming online and in operations. And with this year's increase, you see that it takes the full amount to 100. I believe it's about an additional 25 agents this year.
And taken to a total of 50?
A total of 100 agents.
By the end of the year?
By the end of the year.
Got it. All right. Thank you, Chair. Appreciate it.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, so councillors, that, pardon me, that concludes the questions. We want to give the CFO some time to rest his voice because he's just going to go and give this presentation again for the media. Take questions. I'm in your hands, Mr. Reid. Are we adjourning or recessing? We're recessing. Yes. It is, okay. We can properly adjourn. So first of all, we need a motion to receive all this information we just received. Councillor Chang, you want to move that? All in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And with that, we can adjourn, and we will see you all back here on Wednesday.